Welcome to Radio Omnicor, the podcast where we explore the science of people, performance, and the workplace. I'm Colleen Mclintock, your host, and today we're doing something a little different. Our first ever panel discussion. 360-degree feedback is one of the most powerful tools for leadership development, but it's also one of the trickiest conversations to navigate. How do you deliver feedback in a way that is both honest and constructive? How do you ensure that it leads to real growth rather than resistance? Well, to unpack this, today we're joined by my co-host, Hilton Rudnick, the MD of Omnicor, Pam Ziman, a registered counselor, master coach, and seasoned 360 facilitator, and Allayne Hewson, our very own lead consultant from the OD team, industrial psychologist, and expert feedback facilitator. Together, we'll explore the art of providing 360 feedback, why it matters, practical strategies, and common challenges that come with it. So whether you're delivering feedback or receiving feedback, this episode is packed with valuable insights. And now, here's our conversation. To welcome everyone to the studio. Pam, Allayne, Hilton, we are packed in the studio today. We're thrilled to chat to you a little bit about your experiences. And maybe to kick us off, Allayne, why don't you just introduce a little bit around your relationship to Omnicor, what you do as it comes to the 360s?
Great. Thanks so much for having me on the podcast. It's so exciting. My name is Allayne. I am a consultant in the OD team at Omnicor, and I have the privilege of working with Colleen and Hilton. And in terms of 360 feedbacks, this is something that I've recently started doing in the last few months and really been enjoying as well. So I've got quite a lot of experience in terms of feedbacks, but 360s are fairly new to me.
Great, thank you. And Pam?
Thanks for having me, Colleen. It's really lovely to be here. I've been a professional associate of Omnicor for 10 years, doing both coaching and 360 facilitations. I think I've been doing the facilitation for about 8 years and seen how they've changed, how they've evolved, how we've even now got a post 360. And it's just really lovely experience and lovely work to be doing.
Great, thank you. Hilton, as the tool developer and de facto guru when it comes to feedbacks, do you want to say anything about your involvement?
Just to set the record straight, I never invented 360s. They were done a lot before my time. I've got a special relationship with Omnicor 360. We designed it in a way that's, evolved over time. We think we have a very comprehensive and formidable tool. But of course, everything comes together during the 360 conversation. Everything that happens before and leads up to it is important. But the most important thing is the way that information is delivered and the results of it afterwards. So I think there's a special art in doing it. It's a special type of conversation, like any feedback. It's got to be facilitated. I'm happy to be here talking about it today.
Great, thanks, Hilton. Yeah, for sure. I didn't think you invented 360s. I was just referring to the very specific Omnicor 360. So doing these 360s is not easy. Hilton's just mentioned it's an art. And to set the scene, you've got the person at the center of the 360 in the room, nervous, waiting to get their results. You've got the manager who is also maybe a bit nervous and not sure where this is going to go. There's a lot of uncertainty, although we do prepare people as much as we can, and then the facilitator. And there's so much logistics and potentially things that can go wrong just to get everyone in that room. Most of the people are quite senior. So I'm interested in just how you all go about creating a space that's psychologically safe, that people can build rapport quickly and feel comfortable. They don't know you at all. And just some more about how important that setup phase appears when someone is receiving a 360. Maybe we can start with you, Pam.
Thanks, Colleen. I do. I think that initial connection is really so important. I often start just by breaking the ice. So maybe there's something happening currently in Johannesburg, something you can just start a connection, you can actually start speaking about, because you want the person at the center of the feedback to feel that this is just a report, but that they're an individual and you want to be able to interact with them as a person. So then following from that, I would ask them just some personal information, how long they've been in the role, what do they do, ask them what do they perceive their strengths and development areas to be, so that you're developing a relationship and you're making them feel that you're curious about them. You're not only looking at a report, but you're interested in them as a person. And then the two other things we'll do to try and put them at ease is to explain what is the aim? What is the aim of what we're doing here? The aim of the 360 is really personal and professional growth and development and improving relationships. It really is something about looking forward, and it's about development. And then the second thing that I find works really well is just to be able to put them at ease, is to set the scene and give them an idea of what are we going to do, how are we going to give the report, that this is going to be a dialogue, it's going to be a conversation that, they're free to ask questions. I think that just creates a sense of ease.
Just a containment, because you're right. I think a lot of it is the fear of the unknown, or potentially they've been through this before and they've had a bad experience. And there's a lot of maybe mistrust as to the aim, what's the reason. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. Allayne, do you want to add to anything there?
I agree completely with what Pam has said. Just taking the time to set the scene is very important. And I think at this point, I really do take my time. I don't rush. I would rather spend more time here building rapport and just getting to know the person a little bit, having a conversation with them and asking them about themselves. Because I think it does put people at ease when they know that, as Pam has said, you're interested in who they are as a person. You're not just here to tick a box or get through a task. And the other thing that I like to do is just to acknowledge quite upfront that this kind of process can feel quite daunting and quite exposing, and just check in with them about how they're feeling. Because often when you give them that permission to say, I'm feeling a bit anxious and I'm feeling a bit nervous about this process, it does break the ice a little bit and it just reduces the tension.
Very nice. Hilton, anything from your side?
Yeah, I can always add. I mean, I think Allayne and Pam have got most of it or all of it. Look, anybody is vulnerable in being assessed in any way. The stakes are often high and people are nervous that things are going to come out that are going to be shameful or humiliating. And yeah, so we always spend a considerable time up front just in facilitating that, we're creating the right climate for this conversation to happen. I think 360s require very honest talk that maybe people are not as used to. At the same time, we explain it as a benevolent process, that people are there. We're on their side, really. I mean, you would want someone to leave a 360 session feeling better about themselves and not worse. I think if they're feeling worse, you probably haven't done it quite right. But you are going to cover sensitive issues, and you want to help them navigate through those in a mature way and in a useful way. So that's the process, and you definitely have to create the right climate for that process to happen well.
I'm wondering how you handle the situation, Hilton, where you can see upfront that the people aren't feeling comfortable. You can read from the tone and the tension and the body language that they're not happy. How do you deal with such a situation?
As I said, it's very open, honest talk that you're having over there. If you're reading those signals, you would want to do a exploration of them, where they come from, how you can really co-author with the person how to make the session most useful for them. So, you bring them in as someone who's an expert on their lives, an expert on their work, and you're really there to help them get to the information that is most useful for their future. So, yeah, it does take some expertise. You do have to, I think, be an expert in facilitating conversations rather than an expert on the person's life. You're not making any pretense around that. But, sometimes the situation is heightened by the fact that there are managers in the room. They're an authority figure as well to the person. And I think people are nervous around what's going to come out. I do always, believe that like 80% of a 360, the person could have predicted the results. There's some things that do take people, it's the blind spots that catch people off guard. They wouldn't have known that about themselves. But there's often very good things to share in a 360. And I would probably, if someone was very concerned, I would tell them that, a lot of the stuff that's going to come out here is going to be things that you already know and that are going to be very good for you. There's a lot to celebrate in a 360.
What I sometimes do in that situation is, as Hilton says, definitely an exploration of what's happening and to acknowledge what you're seeing. But then I also try and emphasize that this is a report that is based on perceptions, right? So it's not an objective truth or fact about you, it's perceptions. So, and that helps a lot. But however, even though it is only a perception, perceptions can have a very powerful impact. I mean, after all, perceptions can drive market trends and stock prices up or down. At the very least, they're going to get this indication of how people are perceiving them in the organization. What is their brand at this particular time in this particular organization? And I find that it actually helps quite a lot because they're now seeing, okay, you're not getting something that is just fact here. What you're getting is a snapshot of perceptions, and it's helpful.
Allayne, I'm interested with your background in doing so many psychometric feedbacks and now doing the 360 feedbacks. What is the magic that you find in the 360 feedback? What do you love about that?
I think the big difference for me with the 360 feedback is firstly that you have more voices in the room. And I think it's a good thing. I think when you're giving someone psychometric feedback, you can explore it with them, but there's more of a tendency, I find, for people to disagree with the results or say, well, that's not really like me. When you have a 360 feedback, first of all, you've got the manager in the room who can give their input as well. And they always have an interesting perception, I think, to add and a different understanding of the person. And over and above that, you've got more voices in the actual report. So you're not just getting the person's own perception of themselves, you're hearing from a variety of different people. As Pam just mentioned, it creates this understanding of what is your brand within the business. Not only how do you perceive yourself, but how are you perceived by the various people you interact with on a daily, weekly basis. So I think that is something really special about the report and about the feedback process. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Hilton?
So I think there is a major difference between 360 feedbacks and psychometric assessments. People are often skeptical of psychometric instruments in that, they filled in some questionnaire and it comes out around view about their personality or functioning or cleverness or something. And you have to work harder to get the person's buy-in around whatever you found. But in a 360, if the 5 people who work with you say you're a poor listener, it's hard to disagree with the sentiment that comes from those people. Even if Pam says it's a sentiment, it's a perception, whatever it is, but it's real. People will argue at times and say, well, that's not like me, but it's very difficult if there's a consensus around a theme to do that. So that for me is the major difference. I found psychometric assessments harder. I find 360 feedbacks easier just because of the buy-in.
Yeah, I think I would have to agree with that just because it is difficult to argue, as you say, when there are so many people who have mentioned a certain theme or concern or even something that's going really well. I mean, you get it on the other side too, where people say, I'm really actually not very good at something, but their entire team is telling them that they're really good at it. It's almost a moment in that session where they have to look at it and say, I guess I am better at this than I thought I was. Or perhaps this is a blind spot that I wasn't aware of, because it's just, in a way, it's quite confronting that so many people have the same perception of you, even if you don't necessarily agree or hadn't thought of that to begin with.
Well, I'd be fascinated to hear some of your stories and your experiences that stand out. You've all done so many. So maybe we can talk a bit about a difficult session and how you handled it.
I think the most difficult session I had was when I had a manager who was hypercritical and actually very aggressive. And the person receiving feedback was just getting more and more distraught and more upset. It was just, he was so aggressive and so critical. that it was a really difficult session to facilitate.
Wow. How did you handle that?
I don't think particularly well, because people don't normally behave like that. In retrospect, what should I have done? I probably should have just reflected to the manager and said, I can see that you're very frustrated and you don't have enough time with your direct report, because you would have been able to air some of these feelings and thoughts if you did. So you need that. And also to just try and point out that, again, going back to the aim is about, of course, self-awareness and personal development. But also, if you want growth and you want development, that is not going to happen in an environment where there is high anxiety. It needs to happen in an environment where people feel that there's safety, where people feel that, your manager has an enormous amount of power over you, and that they feel that they are supported.
Hilton?
So yeah, trying to think over here some sessions are definitely more difficult than others. I think the ones that are hardest for me are when people feel like they have to defend anything that's negative about them, and they feel they have to explain away stuff that may come across badly. And you have to keep reminding people that, the objective is to find things over here that make sense for you. We're not here adjudicating or judging in any way. And you have to keep bringing them into how to make the session useful for them. So those are the ones that I find more difficult. I did once have a session with a very senior person that I thought had gone well, but I heard afterwards that the person had really felt undermined, not by me, but by their manager in the room, who, they felt was not on their side in this thing. And it just came out afterwards, so, I thought it had gone okay. I thought it had gone well, but it actually turned out that it hadn't for the person, and they created something very negative for them. But generally, 90% of them are smooth sailing from my perspective.
I would agree with that.
No, me too. I haven't actually had many difficult 360 feedbacks. I can speak from my experience giving assessment feedback and I think you can get the same thing in a 360 setting, which is why I'm mentioning it, where a person just says up front that they just don't believe in the value of it. And they're just defensive from the get-go. In the situation that I'm thinking of, I explored this with a person, I listened to their concerns, I explained what I could, and I just told them that the process is entirely voluntary and there's essentially no downsides because it's a development process. There's nothing that they can lose from the process. I think in a 360 setting, the perception already exists. It's already out there. Perhaps people aren't talking to them about it. So although it might be hard to hear, it is better to know what those perceptions are and then be able to manage them. In the case that I was thinking about, the person didn't really soften. There are cases where they do, and they get to a point of accepting the feedback and engaging in the conversation, especially when they can see that you are a non-judgmental, I think Hilton said benevolent presence in that feedback session. But in some cases, people don't budge and they might be around for the feedback, but they don't necessarily internalize it. And I think that is a personal decision.
That's a good point. I'm interested in debating or discussing the idea of a feedback or a 360 review with anonymous raters versus I know who the people are. I'm going to see the people scores. There's no aggregation or not like I know exactly who scored me. Because generally in our space, we use the anonymity. So that gives people comfort because it can be daunting to rate your manager and feel that if you're saying something that's negative, it could come back to, to be used against you. But there is a case to be made that are we encouraging communication that is always having to be diluted or go through some form of a consultant giving the message, or are we needing to change that up and teach people how to have those direct conversations? So I think, Pam, you've had experience with both. I mean, we typically don't get asked to do, we always use anonymity. Apart from the manager will always be known to the person they score. But I think you've been involved in 360s where they actually know who's rated them.
I have, Colleen, and I do. I think that there are pros and cons to both. So the advantage of anonymous feedback is that it can be very honest. There's no fear of reprisals. That is an advantage of it. The way I see it is that the person receiving the feedback is not getting the context. And I do find very often that they spend a lot of time trying to be a bit of an investigator, a bit of a detective to work out who said this about me, who said it. And when you know who said it, then you have much more context. The person can explain, and context is huge. They can give the context around it, they can give examples, and then you can you have this ability to have a meaningful conversation, to have a conversation as to how did you interpret that? What made you say that? Why do you think that? How could I do differently? However, that does exist in the Omnicor report as well. And I often do invite people to say, yes, you're seeing this, it feels uncomfortable or it's unexpected. You can have that meaningful conversation. And certainly when the manager's there, then it's not anonymous. So part of the Omnicor report is very much not anonymous, and they're able to have it. But even if you're getting from your subordinates a whole lot of feedback that is saying something that you would like to explore more, you can still do that. You can still have those conversations. So to my mind, both have pros and cons.
I mean, I think you can make a case for both. There's no doubt that it's useful. I do think you want people to be uninhibited when they're completing the 360 and not worry about blowback, what could come back and hurt them. So I think that's the main advantage. I mean, I definitely have those people who, in detective mode, I think that they have the view that they can be more dismissive of comments from people who maybe aren't their work enemies or have relationships with that are just not going well. And the opposite is more useful, that it doesn't really matter where it came from. If this is a perception about you, it's something that if you think it should be addressed, then you should be address it, no matter where it came from. So, you shouldn't only be worried about addressing things that come from someone who has more authority over you than, someone who's maybe reporting to you. So I believe in anonymous feedback mostly. I do sometimes have situations where people are completely mystified that a comment has been made or that they've got a low score for something. And I always encourage them to go have a conversation about it afterwards to the people they know. It wouldn't be like an attacking conversation, like, why did you score me low? But it would rather be, I'm trying to work on my conflict management and I'm trying to understand where I could do better at this. Could you help me? Have there been some examples of things where you've seen that I haven't done well on this and I could do better? So that kind of conversation, I would encourage them to go have. So, in my view, the pros of anonymity outweigh the cons, but I've never really been in a feedback situation where, it's all laid bare about who said what.
I think I'm the same, Hilton. I haven't been in a situation where I was dealing with comments that weren't anonymous. I've only dealt with reports where we have anonymous comments. I think what is helpful, though, especially if they do want to go more into detective mode, is just to understand which group is rating them lower or higher for a certain dimension or even item, because then you can at least understand, okay, but it seems like your colleagues are not seeing this from you. So it doesn't really matter if it's a particular colleague, but your colleagues aren't seeing this behavior. Your subordinates might be seeing it from you. So how could you display this with your colleagues more? Or why are they not seeing this from you? You might be showing it in other contexts, but you're not showing it in this one. So, is there a certain group of people who you need to build your brand with better in your business? So I suppose if they want to go into detective mode, that is a way that they can do it. But I've generally found that if they are trying to figure out who exactly said what, it almost derails the session a little bit, because that's not what it's about. And that's what I say to people as well, is try to resist the temptation to figure out who said what. It's more around the trends and the themes that we're seeing and what this says about how you're showing up in your role and in the business. It's not necessarily about who you need to go and find afterwards and have a serious conversation with. It's more about how are you perceived.
I think what Pam said is really interesting about when you're anonymous, you have no boundaries around what you can share. And certainly we have seen our fair share of very harsh comments, and we can maybe do a round of those. I remember one of the reports, I even said to Hilton, we have to take this out because, we don't tamper with qualitative feedback, but it was so bad where somebody, had it not been anonymous, they would never have said something. There was something about this individual doesn't deserve the air that they breathe. Something so personal or so cruel. And but had that person had their name to that comment, they would not have made that comment. I don't think.
Sure, that's very harsh. I don't think I've ever seen something that blatant in any of the 360 reports that I've seen.
It's worth thinking about those things because they are often, maybe more regular than often, but there's often comments in a 360 report that are outliers. Not even go against the grain of what's in the rest of the report, but, just clearly belong to one person. And, part of the art of, I think, like harvesting what's important in a 360 is to find comments and ideas that are more general than the outliers. So, there can sometimes, I have definitely been in a session where someone became fixated on a comment about the integrity. And it was like anything else in the session could not make them feel okay about whatever else came out. There was like definitely a wounding comment for them about who they were as a person. And they kept coming back to it. And they were really getting stuck on that. And I had to work hard to help them move on. I don't know if they did. I think they came out of that session feeling like, whatever, like I've been misunderstood completely by my staff or something. And so we do have to adjudicate, I think, in some way where we're putting our focus.
I think that the way that we try and do it is to really emphasize that people should not get bogged down in the detail and focus only on the detail. And it's important to look at the themes. That is helpful, but it also is not always the way human nature is. And people do take criticism very personally. And there's that feedback ratio, which says that people need to hear 4 positive things for every one negative piece of feedback. And if they don't, then they actually stop taking the criticism to heart. So I think that it's lovely to receive and to give positive feedback, but it is really difficult to hear it. So I just think that as facilitators, we have to be very aware of that.
Well, that's a good segue into my next question, Pam, which is, the skeptics or what are the risks in doing a 360 in an organization? And there are risks. I do recall working with an exco team. Hilton, you'll remember who the client was. And obviously this individual things were not going well in the organization for this individual. And they hadn't been giving feedback and I guess just not dealing with it and not confronting it. And this individual had his feedback and resigned straight afterwards because it was just so noticeable for him to see that people were not comfortable or happy with what he was doing in the organization. So, what are the dangers of doing a 360 feedback in terms of how people receive those messages, and could it potentially be damaging for them after the feedback?
I think the intention behind the 360 is important. If the 360s are in the organization as a developmental kind of intervention that's helping people to grow, I think that's more useful. But I have seen 360s being used to get rid of people. So they're looking for evidence that this is a bad person and they want to use it to, to create concrete evidence that everyone cannot work with this person and that they don't have the endorsement. And I think those are more problematic. I don't think you should use 360s in that way at all.
I think that's why it just goes back to something that Hilton said earlier. and that it's people do feel and very vulnerable, and you are exposed. The very purpose of the report is to try and surface some development areas and blind spots. And so I think that's why to set the scene and the facilitation of it is what's really important, because that is such valuable data, but it has to be given and received in a way that is constructive.
I think it also just highlights almost the weightiness or the responsibility as a feedback provider, as a facilitator, because the way that you give that feedback can really impact a person. And it's not necessarily even sometimes not about how you give the feedback, but it's just about people's perceptions. And you can't shy away from that. And that's what we said earlier. It's very confronting. It's hard to be confronted with that and look away. It's very in your face at times. So we have a big responsibility as facilitators to position it in such a way that is still uplifting and focused on a person's growth and development. I think what we can't control as facilitators, which we do try to control in terms of change management with the organization, is what Hilton is talking about, and that's how it is used in the business and the purpose behind the 360. And we can do as much as we possibly can there, but unfortunately, I don't think it's something we have full control over. And people may also come in with their own understanding of what has happened previously in the business and how things have been used, or their fears around how this kind of information would be used. So I think that there are real risks that we need to be aware of, and we need to speak about that with our clients up front and have those conversations and try to manage that. But I think there's a point where it does lie with the organization running the 360, and we can advise. I think that's our role.
I think there's much more opportunity in a 360 than danger. People are giving you a gift. It's so rare in your life that you would have people who know you well telling you exactly how you can improve in a way that is generous. It's really useful. It's making something that would normally be invisible to you very visible, and there's great opportunity in doing that. And most, I don't know how many often people have 360s, but for most people there's one or two in a lifetime, and there is such a gift that can come out of that if you get people into the right frame, I think that they can take the gift rather than see this as dangerous and exposing. And that's part of our job.
I really agree with what Hilton's saying, and at least 90% of people come away from that 360 feedback feeling uplifted, very grateful for sharing the positive feedback. It's really humbling, and they really feel so grateful. And then also, mostly they just say, aha, that's my blind spot, and that's my development area, and this is what I'm going to do. So I think that you obviously do get the occasional situations which are very tricky, and you do, but at least 90% are what people perceive this as a gift.
Pam, I was going to move towards how we use this in coaching, and because there is a wall of information. You spoke earlier about the ratio of feedback 4-1, criticisms to 1 positive. Is that what you said?
No, the other way around.
Yeah, I think it's not that neatly packaged in the 360 feedback. I can imagine people do shut down a bit because we do focus on what's going well and we celebrate the quantitative, but then we're like, okay, let's get stuck in now. Where do you need to do the work? And I wonder how that lands for people just in terms of shutting down or feeling overwhelmed with this wall of information. So the question I have is, how do you harvest so that the client leaves at the end of the session knowing, okay, here's at least 3 things that are manageable and that I'm going to work on, and then how that helps you in coaching?
So I think it's a step back is, again, celebrating the wins and just really being proud of what people are doing well. And then to ask the question, what are your major takeaways from today's session? They can also have time to let the information marinate and to allow it to process, but then to figure out what are their major takeaways. And from that, what medium-term or long-term goals can they set? Also, and what can they commit to right now? What actions can they commit to that would just move that scale a little bit? I think that's incredibly useful because people are now given this information and their brain can work in a way to say, aha, I can change this. This might be a development area, might be a blind spot, but now I have power over it. I can change it. So that question, what are your takeaways and what goals can you set? What can you commit to maybe in the next 2 to 3 weeks? Just changes it to being much more future orientated and goal orientated.
The time management of these sessions is very tricky because you've all spoken about how important it is to be meticulous when you're setting it up. You have 90 minutes, sometimes an hour. You have 3 different people in the room needing, well, including yourself, but everyone kind of needing different things from you. So any tips or ideas around how you manage that time and what happens when it goes wrong?
I mean, I think we've worked out a fairly good method of navigating our report. Interestingly, so in a typical report, you'll have, something like, I don't know, 50 to 70 quantitative questions and maybe 3 qualitative questions. And the qualitative questions, I tend to do them in the beginning of the session. And they're often like a preamble or like a musical overture to whatever's going to come later. I try my best to have like a not knowing approach, right? Whatever's going to come is going to come. It's a conversation. We're going to share information. And I have like sometimes looked to the 360 before my session and I look at the comments and, there's things like this is a very demanding person and this person is getting into conflict with people and those kind of things. And I form an impression about that person. And then when I meet them, something completely different comes up for me. Like I think I'm going to meet a tyrant. And I meet someone who's warm and sensitive and friendly. And often it's the environment. So, like in a 360 I did recently, there was someone who was working in a parastatal where the people around them were in parastatal mode. So things took long, they didn't return phone calls, they were unprofessional, there was lots of talk and no action. And this person had like a very high action orientation, just wanted to get things done. So a bit of a fish out of water, someone with maybe like a more energized corporate mindset in an environment where, the people around them just took long to do everything. So the 360 reflected that world where the people around them saw this person as very demanding, but they were just trying to be efficient in their job. So, you really have to, I think, be wary of your own pre-thinking around what's going to be coming and go in just very open as well. Just like you would expect the person to come into the session and be open, you also have to be that because we do make, generally by the end of a 360, there's a story about the person that's emerged. And it's useful to try and capture that story. These are the headlines. You're very efficient, you're amazing in your job, you're in a way feeling constrained by your environment, you're trying to get your colleague, whatever, to really get to the heart of what is the story of this person at work. So in my closing comments, I try and give that story. I try and say, this is what I think I've heard. How does that sit with you? And when it's right, and it's not always right, sometimes I get it wrong, but when it's right, it feels like you've created a good chamber piece, and the person understands how the world sees them and how they are enabled or not by the environment and the people around them. So that was a long answer to what I think wasn't even a question.
Sure. I do think that time management and pacing is very important. Usually in the back of my mind, I have a sense of how much time I have for each section. And I'm not trying to go through the report in minute detail because there just is so much rich data there. But as Hilton said, I get a sense before I go in as to the story the report is telling. Then I also have to just hear what the other person is saying and what the other people are saying in the room and adjust based on that. And then we might get into an interesting discussion on a certain development area or a certain point of contention, let's say in the qualitative section, which is always such a good point to dwell on. And then in that case, I just won't spend as much time on that when I get to the quantitative numbers section, because we've already discussed it. And I think the aim isn't to get through every piece of information, it's to make sure that they leave the session with a clear understanding of the story the report is telling and where those key areas of strength and development seem to lie. I think if you've done that and you've managed to leave them feeling good after the session and with a clear sense of what they can do going forward and what their next step should be, then I think we've done a good job, rather than necessarily having to get through every single thing in the report.
The feedback we get, well, about actually every individual in this room, but the feedback we get, Hilton, about your feedbacks is always incredible. People experience you as a deep listener, but at the same time, just not feeling judged and very insightful. Yeah, well done. You set the standard high. You've trained most people, and it's effortless for you. It seems like we can just throw a report at you, and in 2 minutes you can go do a 360, and it will look as if you've been preparing for an hour. But yeah, I do think that we do have a privilege to make a big impact on people's lives, because although it's quite bruising, in the coaching space, I think the 360 feedback is the thing that kind of wakes people up from a dream world in a way of, maybe this is going well, maybe it's not, and there are the facts. So it's a relief for people to be able to see it there. Yeah, I think the time management piece is a challenge to sell to organizations. When we say the sessions are 90 minutes, they bulk at the idea. But actually, this is where the magic happens in that conversation. And it's quite hard to really explain to them until they've been through it why the time is necessary.
So the 360 report's full of numbers and conversations and everything, but it's actually just a departure point for a conversation. It's not really biblical in giving you a truth. It's a way to use the session to have a deep conversation with the person about what are the next steps for their growth and the way the world sees them. If you get that out of it, it doesn't really matter like where you land in the report, because there's, as everyone's saying, not enough time to do everything. So you want to be quite selective, and you want to park the stuff that you've covered. If the report 50 in so many different places comes up with a main theme, like once you've got that, park it and move on and find something else that's going to be useful. So there is a real skill, I think, in navigating where you're going to land in the, and sometimes you're doing that on the fly. It depends on the emerging conversation.
The only thing I would add to that is just to say to both the person who's getting the feedback and the manager that you are going to receive the report. So we actually don't have time to go through every single quantitative item, but we feel free to discuss it at a later date and to work through it yourself. And that then calms things down a lot.
Well, I think that's a really good place to wrap. Maybe we can do a quick round with just why you would advocate for leaders, particularly, to do a 360. What's the benefit for them?
I think you were saying earlier today somewhere, Colleen, in a conversation that, the more senior you get in an organization, the less feedback. You land up in your own echo chamber of, doing stuff and, not really getting honest feedback from the people around you. So there's, the only way we grow as individuals is from feedback. Getting feedback from the world in the conversations we have are one of the key mechanisms of growth. And you just have to be open. You just got to be listening carefully enough to that feedback to be able to do that. So leaders, more than anyone, need to hear that. And I can tell you one of the lowest items, all our 360s are different, but there is a Venn diagram of common things that we ask. And one of the things that's lower scoring is the item regularly ask other people for feedback on how they're doing, right? It's always one of the lowest scoring because so few people do it. But the whole 360 thing is really that. It's giving people feedback on how they're doing so they can take the opportunity and grow from there. So, for me, if there's an opportunity for anyone listening this, if they're vacillating about should they have a 360, shouldn't they, for organizations, it's very useful. not only on an individual level, but on a group level. You can take all the data that you get in an organization and understand something about the culture of the interpersonal dynamics in that organization. And it's very useful on a group level as well as an individual level. So, yeah, I'm a big supporter of 360s.
I have to agree. I think it's just such a valuable opportunity. Hilton called it a gift earlier, and I think that's such a good way of thinking about it. Because in what other space would you ever hear people's feedback about you on so many different things all at once? I don't think there is another opportunity like this. And I think that's why it feels so daunting and makes us feel so vulnerable, because it is a lot to deal with in one go. But that's also where the value lies. And there's so much to be gained from hearing how people perceive you and seeing what your brand is in the organization. I would say to anyone that it's a good idea to do a 360 feedback, even people who aren't leaders. But of course, at a leadership level, your scope of influence is a lot broader, and you need to develop different skills than when you're just a technical specialist, for example. And so that's also where the value lies, is how do you need to adjust your leadership style, and what are people seeing about you that you're not necessarily seeing about yourself? So it's a great opportunity to see blind spots, and also to see the things that you're not aware of for yourself, your hidden strengths. And I think, as Pam said earlier, it's about celebrating what you're doing well just as much as identifying the things that you could be doing better.
Thank you. Pam, you'll have the
Yeah.
last say.
Feedback is a gift, and it's in every endeavor. I mean, if you think about sport or any other area, it's a huge opportunity for self-insight. You need those two things. You need awareness, and then you need to change behavior. And a third thing, you need to continue practicing that. But this is the first step. So you're getting insight, you're getting awareness, and it's an absolute gift.
Great. Well, thank you, everyone. And I think, Allayne, what you just mentioned now is so important about the impact we have as leaders, that to know this information will really have a cultural impact if leaders can shift their behaviors, particularly those ones that people find tricky and difficult. It can make a big difference for the organization. So thank you all for joining. It was really lovely to spend an hour with you, and we look forward to further sessions with you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us, Colleen.
Thanks so much for having us.
That's it for this episode of Radio Omnicor. A huge thank you to our expert panel, Hilton, Pam, and Allayne, for sharing the insights on how to make 360 feedback a meaningful and impactful conversation. We talked about the importance of framing feedback well, practical techniques for delivering it effectively, and some of the common challenges leaders and teams face. One key aspect we touched on is the role of anonymity in 360 feedback. Whether to keep responses confidential or opt for an open feedback approach can depend on organizational culture, trust levels, and the desired outcomes. A big shout out to our producer, Sia Dlamini, for her amazing professional job always. If you're interested in learning more about how Omnicor approaches 360 feedback, check out our website or reach out to us. We'd love to continue the conversation. As always, if you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. I'm Colleen Mclintock, and this has been Radio Omnicor. Until next time, keep the feedback flowing.